All right. Well, we'll get started. Welcome everyone to the final installment of our winter lecture series in 2026. I'm Dr. Audrey Thorsted, the Director of Programming here at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, or HMML, HMML as many people know it. If you're new here, we're an international organization based out of Minnesota in the United States. And over the last 60 years, our purpose has largely remained the same: to preserve and share the world's handwritten past in order to inspire a deeper understanding of our present and future. Handwritten books, or manuscripts, as many people know them, are clues documenting what humans over thousands of years thought important enough to write down and share. Therefore, we photograph manuscripts around the world so their contents can be made available for centuries to come. We place a special priority on manuscripts located in regions endangered by war, political instability, or other threats. Preservation begins through partnerships with local libraries, which we'll hear about in just a little bit. And these are agreements that allow HMML to take digital images of the manuscripts in these local library collections. Digitization is done entirely through local teams to whom HMML provides equipment, training, technical support, and payment for their work. We photograph everything in a collection because you just don't know what might be significant or important in the future. Copies of these digital images are given to the local libraries that hold the manuscripts, and another copy comes to HMML here in Minnesota. HMML employs catalogers and other staff to ensure that these digital images are identified, supported for long-term access, and made freely available to the public via our website. Scholars and researchers from all over the world visit HMML both physically at St. John's and virtually in our reading room, which houses millions of photographs of manuscripts. Our work is solely funded by donations and grants. Please consider donating to HMML to help us continue the important work of preserving cultural heritage around the world. As we celebrate 60 years of operation, this year's winter lecture series turns inward to our wonderfully hardworking, talented HMML team. Today you will hear about the extraordinary work done to secure partnerships and continue to build trust and community across borders. I'm delighted to introduce one of my brilliant colleagues to whom you will hear from today. Dr. Matt Heintzelman is the curator of Western European manuscripts and special collections. He joined HMML in 2001 as associate director and assumed his current role in 2004. He holds a BA in Modern Languages from the University of Notre Dame and was awarded his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago in Germanic Studies. He later earned his MLIS from the University of Iowa. He has presented and published widely and has curated more than 9 exhibitions at HMML since 2015. Many of these exhibitions you can find online, and they're beautiful. You should go check them out. He has also written more than a dozen editorial stories for HMML's website. We will put the links to all of these in the chat for you to access. Heintzelman's work focuses on cataloging and supporting nearly 50,000 manuscripts on microfilm from Austria, Germany, and Switzerland, and support for microfilms from Sweden, England, and elsewhere in Northern and Central Europe. In addition, he also catalogs and supports nearly 11,000 rare printed books and hundreds of manuscripts here on site. Before I turn it over to our speaker, one final bit of housekeeping. There will be time for questions at the end. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the presentation or after. You can open the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Dr. Catherine Walsh, Director of Cataloging and Library Services, will lead the Q&A at the end, and we will get to as many questions as possible. So without further ado, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the presentation. Dr. Heintzelman, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Audrey. And welcome. Hello from the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in central Minnesota. You've heard a little bit about me, and you know that I've been here a very long time, almost 25 years. In a couple months, it'll be 25 years. Today, I'm sharing some ideas, some thoughts, some of them somewhat random, about the work that HMML's done and how I see HMML actually, what HMML actually is, as opposed to what HMML does. And it's sort of an ongoing thought process that I've had through the years. I'm going to especially be sharing photographs from my time last year in Austria, but I will also include photographs that I took in two previous trips to Austrian libraries in 2013 and 2015. The nice thing about being in a library is I don't need to use wallpaper for the back. You can see this looks like a library, and you can even see my microfilm reader behind me. So it does get used on a fairly regular basis. I'm going to switch over and share my slides, and I've got lots of pictures, probably more than I should, so I hope I can get done before dinner hour. So let me see. I want to share. And we're experimenting today. I'm doing this from a PDF rather than from PowerPoint, although the slides were made in PowerPoint. There were so many pictures, the file got too large, and I had a feeling it wouldn't be happy. So I hope everyone out there is seeing some books on a shelf at the Abbey of Lambach in Upper Austria. So in 2025, I was able to visit about 24 libraries in Austria to look for any unknown data on Himmel's work in the years from 1964 to 1973, which is the first place that Himmel worked overseas. During that time, I was able to meet with librarians and take pictures of some of the things in their collections, as well as some of the spaces where they work, and to talk also about the possibility not only of the past, but also the future. What could we do with the microfilms? And one of the things we've talked about extensively is, can we digitize the microfilms and make them available online? And I would say that virtually every librarian I spoke with was very much in favor of this. We have since then gotten agreements with a number of libraries, but it is an ongoing process. And as you'll hear, when you're working with communities, each community has its own set of structure of its own. And so our relationships with those communities are guided also by what goes on in those communities beyond our power. So when I went over in 2025, I made a point of trying to visit as many libraries as I could in 5 weeks. 5 weeks isn't a lot of time when you realize we spent 8 years there a long time ago. But with modern connections and with able to use apps on your phone to find uh, train, train schedules and get your tickets and all that, there was a certain amount that could be done in that amount of time. I was able to visit libraries in or near 5 major cities, and those cities are, of course, Vienna here in the east, and then Linz in Upper Austria, Salzburg on the border with Germany, Innsbruck in Tyrol, and then Graz down in the Steiermark, Styria. And I had to unfortunately omit several places I would have liked to have gone, partly because of the lack of time and partly because some of them were remote enough I could not easily or readily get there by public transit. And some of those include important monasteries like Admont, Vorau, St. Paul im Lavental, Altenburg, Zottel, Schlegel. All of these places were on my list initially of places to go, and it simply wasn't possible. As well as the cities of Klagenfurt and Bregenz, which are here in the far south and on the far western edge of Austria. 5 weeks was simply not enough time to get to all those places. So to step back for a second and just to think about, we talk about the preservation mission of Himmel and what it is. And I should mention right away that we do have a couple of specialized terms from Himmel that I will be using frequently, and you just have to kind of put that into our context. One is, of course, our initials HMML initially stood for the Hill Monastic Manuscript Library. Today it stands for the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. HMML is always a mouthful to say, and so we have adopted the pronunciation, many of us, of saying simply Himmel, which has the double meaning, of course, for German speakers as being the word for heaven. So many of us are already working in heaven, even if we're not ready to go to the final heaven. Um, Another term that we use very frequently, and I think this is probably a fairly unique term to our work, is the idea of the owning library or owning libraries. And we use this constantly without even thinking about it because one of the core values of core work that Himmel does is that we photograph manuscripts that belong to other institutions, other communities. And so we always have to take into account what the owners of those manuscripts want us to do. And so, unlike many institutions, many libraries that digitize their own materials or subscribe to digital resources, what we constantly have to think about is what would that monastery, what would that community, whether it's in Ethiopia or Austria or India, what would they want us to do? And do we need to write to them to ask for permission to do something if we think it's a little beyond our original agreement? So you'll be hearing owning library and you'll be hearing Himmel quite frequently. Um, so the project started initially with a very narrow focus of just photographing manuscripts that were related to monastic society, and in particular Benedictine society. And it was an outgrowth of what happened in World Wars One and Two, when so much cultural good was destroyed across Europe at that time. And so they were looking at their own history. Today, of course, we've expanded that model to many other places. But initially, we were looking for monasteries and monastic collections that were not available to study elsewhere. Um, Over time, the two main examples we had for people doing something like this were from St. Louis University, which worked in the Vatican Library, and the University of Notre Dame, my alma mater, which worked at the Ambrosiana Library in Milan in the 1950s and early 1960s. And so one difference in what they did at the Hill Library is that they decided to do this as an open-ended project, which means that we would go into as many places that would allow us in to do the photography, and that we would have to have a way to work with each of these different communities. It's not just one community to think about. Each community is going to have a different set of expectations, a different set of limits on what they feel we can or can't do with their materials. Um, Initially, we only worked with medieval and early modern manuscripts. The contract specified that we would photograph everything up to the year 1600. Today, we photograph manuscripts into the 20th century. Um, and initially, we looked primarily at Italy, Switzerland, and Austria. We didn't have much success in Italy and Switzerland to begin with, although we have since worked in both countries. But in Austria is where you will hear in a moment we had our first real success. Over the years, I also want to put in here that over the years, my own thinking about what Himmel is has shifted from time to time, depending on which part of my personality came to the fore, which part of my personality was of my multiple personalities was taking the lead. So initially, when I came 25 years ago, most of my presentations about Himmel focused on the preservation and the photographic preservation of manuscripts that we were doing elsewhere. And to me at the time, it seemed like that was a no-brainer. Of course, you have to take photographs of these things to have second copies available for study, to have backup copies somewhere else in the world. Well, of course, that was the medievalist in me. Since I worked in medieval German, I came here and I thought, well, of course, I want access to the manuscripts, and I can't go to everywhere in Germany and Austria to see them. Here's a place where I can see them. So that just seemed obvious. But of course, not everyone's a medievalist. So then, after getting my library degree, I started using the term meta library. I started thinking of HMML or Himmel as being a library of libraries, that all the work that we did was a way of bringing together collections from different places where they could be used next to each other, that you could see two copies of the same text from two different libraries. And again, it's not incorrect, but it just seemed a little more structural. It seemed like a way of looking at it that wasn't really paying attention to what was going on. And through the exposure over time here at St. John's to the Benedictines and the Benedictine ways of thinking and lifestyle, I came to see HMML as an extension of Benedictine values, Benedictine teaching, of listening, of stability, of respect for others who are different from yourself. And of course, these are all core values to what finally became my current, and I'm guessing will be remain my interpretation of what Himmel is, and that is I see Himmel as a library of relationships. And that is to say, unlike other libraries that focus on collecting books, digital recordings, digital subscriptions, etc., we focus on collecting relationships with other communities around the world. And in collecting these relationships, we have to nurture these relationships. We can't simply acquire them and leave them. That's not like a book that sits on the shelf for 100 years and we hope someone will read it. But these relationships have to be renewed over time. In a way, this really addresses the romantic in me, which has always been there, trying to figure out what it is that makes Himmel tick. Why does Himmel work? And I think it's through this ability to form relationships with other communities around the world that we've really brought ourselves forward. So the building of communities started already in 1964, 1965, when Father Oliver Kapsner went to Austria initially going to Italy and having only partial success there. And then in Switzerland, he also was not able to convince the monastic librarians to work with him. And his third stop in Austria was at a monastery in Kremsmünster, a Benedictine monastery with history going back to the, I believe, 8th century, a very, very early establishment for that part of the world. Initially, the librarian did not want to work with him. The librarian said no. He had talked with other librarians and said, no, that's just not what we want to do. We don't want to have you handling our most valuable things, these manuscripts from the Middle Ages. The person who made it possible, and really is one of the key people for the fact that we even exist as a library, is the tall person you see in the photograph here. It's a black and white photograph, which I only found last year. This is one of the very few photographs I've ever seen from the beginning of the work in Kremsmünster. The tall man is the abbot from Kremsmünster, Albrecht Bruckmeier, who overruled the librarian and told the librarian, no, you have to work with him. You have to let Father Oliver Kapsner take these pictures of the manuscripts. The other people in the photograph there, going from left to right, is the guest master, whose name I don't provide here, but of course, the guest master is in charge of all hospitality at the monastery. Then the abbot, and then Sadie Power, the wife of Eugene Power, who was from the largest microfilm company in the United States, and then Father Oliver Kapsner at the far right. And Eugene Power was there. The forming of relationships was already there at the very beginning because Father Oliver, of course, while fluent in German and familiar with monasteries, had no technical background in microfilming, had no funding to be able to do this, had no access to get to the materials. So he had to start building relationships with all of these different entities to be able to even start work at all. The librarian who initially opposed Father Oliver's work, once he was overruled by the abbot, suddenly became the greatest facilitator we could have had at that time. Not only did he allow Father Oliver in to do the photography at Kremsmünster, but he also put Father Oliver in direct contact with 10 other librarians, introduced him, got him going. He worked with him to each library we have an agreement with. You'll see an example in a moment. and he helped to improve the language in that. So he really moved things forward in a way that very few people could have at that time. His name, Willibrord Neumüller. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a typo. It's Willibrord Neumüller, not Wilbrod. I think Willibrord is a great name, by the way. Um, I don't know that I would want it as middle name, but it's there. Um, but he was one of the instrumental people to get the work underway. And Father Oliver talks about him frequently, but mostly in the context of what he did to help the work happen. I'd like to share a little bit because, as I say, when we work with these communities, what we find is, of course, every community is different. The members of the community are different, and we hear different sides of their story. So Eugene Power, I mentioned in the previous slide, uh, describes his trip to Kremsmünster this way with Sadie. He says, "We, that is Eugene and Sadie, we were greeted by Dr. P. Willebrod Neumüller, a big, burly monk who proved to be one of the most extroverted, engaging, and friendly men I've ever met. He ushered us into his library, which was magnificent. In addition to its manuscript collection, it had a tremendous collection of early printed books from about 1480 to 1800. I was impressed." Uh, this was great because Father Oliver had already told Eugene Power that he shouldn't bring his wife to the monastery because she wouldn't be allowed in. It's a male monastery, and women weren't allowed in there. And there wouldn't be much to do in Kremsmünster because it's just a little town. So, but she decided she wanted to go anyway. She didn't stay in Vienna. And fortunate for her, she and her husband ran into Father Willebrod in the evening when they first got there. And after a couple glasses of bourbon and after a bottle of wine and then some supper and a couple more bottles of wine, um, Father Willebrod did something that kind of surprised them. So again, this is quoting from the account from Eugene Power. Jumping to his feet, Father Willebrod led us into the night. His robes flapped in the damp wind as we marched through the medieval gates of the monastery and across the worn cobblestones of the inner court. Stopping at a low, heavy wooden door set into the wall, he stooped to open it with a large key. Inside, a narrow stone staircase led upward. We followed the wavering beacon of Father Willebrod's flashlight up 3 musty, winding flights. Pausing at the top and putting his finger to his lips, he whispered, "They're all asleep in their cells." Then he proceeded to show us through the entire monastery. It was eerie, but fascinating. So, we tend to turn our histories into sort of carved in stone. This is what happened at this point. And we forget that these are real people that we're working with, and these are really wonderful people to have as our friends. So it's de rigueur in any presentation about Himmel's work that we walk through a quick idea of what it was we were trying to do. And here you see, I will show you very quickly 2 sets of slides that walk you through the collection of metadata, as you see Father Oliver typing up the inventory cards that were put on each microfilm to tell people what was on them, along with moving the books from the big, very beautiful library. This is at Zeitenstetten. This is not at Kremsmünster. I'll come back to that in a second, but unfortunately, we have virtually no pictures of the early work. Until recently, I had no pictures whatsoever of Lambach, except now I have pictures that I took at Lambach. But they would have to take the books from the library to a workroom elsewhere in the monastery because there wasn't proper electricity or often not even any heat in the libraries themselves. They would put the manuscripts on a large table with a glass plate that went over it to hold it flat. They would take photographs using microfilm, using the film that we were used to up until 20 years ago. And then they would send those off to the pictures that were taken, they would send to Vienna to be processed. And if they looked okay after they saw what the processed film looked like, then they would be sent to Michigan where they would make copies in Ann Arbor, Michigan, one copy coming to Minnesota to be used by scholars here, one copy going into storage in Ann Arbor, and one copy going to the library in Austria. So every library got a copy of all the microfilms made at their library. Um, it seems like a very cumbersome process. When you look at this, you say, well, this is a lot of work to do to get a copy of a manuscript. And yet what they did in the process was they were able to microfilm nearly 30,000 manuscripts in Austria at 70 different libraries, more than 70. And a quick estimate that I was working on this morning says that this probably produced somewhere between 7.5 to 8 million photographs. And each photograph would have probably 2 pages on it, which means they probably photographed more than 15 million pages of manuscript material in Austria. That's pretty impressive in 8 years. We'll come back to Zeitenstedt in a few moments when we see some of the later pictures. Just to let you know, Father Oliver did have a life outside of the monastic libraries. Here you see him in Vienna, or some of the pictures. You see him sampling some wine with Julian Plant, the longtime director of the Hill Library. These are all just a little bit of what we have of the tidbits of the life that went on. Sadly, we have virtually no photographs of the team working in most of the monasteries and most of the other libraries, state libraries and university libraries where Himmel worked in the 1960s and 1970s. Here, just to mention quickly, you see the very first contract signed with Kremsmünster. It lays out in German the various things that we can or and cannot do with the microfilms that we make, and that we would give a copy to the owning library. We would not just give it out without letting them know. We need to get permission to make copies for others. All of that is laid out. The contract is signed and dated November 23rd, 1964. So in a way, that's almost like our birth date when you look at it. This was the day that the very first relationship was established between what became Himmel and one of its partner libraries. And I think that's pretty significant for the rest of our work. Next to that, there's a letter from Oliver Kapsner to the abbot at Lilienfeld, where we worked a year and a half later, where he reminds him that, he signed the agreement that they would be able to do the filming there. He refers to his team as being, Austrians who are very industrious. They're fleißige Arbeiter. And so, it's okay to let them into the monastery because even lay people were not regularly supposed to be in there. And he also mentions that they'll get a copy of the films as well as, and I thought this was a very cute phrase in German, a hübsches Lesegerät, which would be, hübsch is usually term you'd refer to like a little girl, so like pretty or something like that. But in this case, I translated it more as handsome, as a handsome reader, microfilm reader. The hübsch just seemed like a very interesting term to use in this case, but certainly I think that shows that Father Oliver attempting to sort of work together with the Austrians and have some fun with them and not be too serious. Stepping back from the early history for a moment, I wanted to give you this is the eye candy part of the presentation. When we think of these libraries overseas, we usually think in terms of the libraries as spaces, which is an oddly modern sense of library because, of course, today most libraries are trying to establish themselves as spaces of learning and not so much as repositories of knowledge and materials. So these are some of the spaces that I've been able to visit in Austria as a part of my work at Himmel. I have to admit, I get really excited to get into places that are usually behind the monastery walls where they don't let people in. Part of the fun, though, as you see in the picture here in the corner, in the lower right corner, one of the fun things is that you get sometimes to go through the hidden doors behind the door, the bookshelves, and sometimes you get to climb up the spiral stairs and go out on the balcony. Because how many of us have not been in a place like this where you go in and you say, wow, I want to go up there, but they won't let me. Well, if you're a librarian and you work at Himmel, you might get that chance. So I can't promise it though. Certainly the most beautiful library probably anywhere in that part of the world is at Admont. And Altenburg, they were using, when I visited, they were using the library as a venue for concerts, a summer series of concerts. But also they had excavated part of the old monastery, and you had an opportunity to see some of the little book nooks, literal nooks in the wall that were used as bookshelves in the Middle Ages. So you get a little bit of an idea of what monastic life and monastic libraries were like. But as you see, these are all fabulous places, and they're all fun to visit. And if you're into books, you really can't stop, just kind of swooning every time you walk into one of those. However, not everything happens in those big fancy rooms. And the big fancy rooms are really cool to look at, but they don't let you touch anything. So one of the things that I was there to do was to track the work that Himmel did years ago. And so one of the first things I would ask the librarians is, do you still have the microfilms that we made for you back 50 years ago? And virtually in every case, they did still have them. In most cases, they could find them very readily. And in some cases, they would brought me to them so that I could actually see things that were made for them by our library. And here you go, again and again, monastery after monastery, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands in some cases, boxes of microfilm, all provided by the Hill Library back in the earliest stages of our work. And even here at Kremsmünster, the first place we worked, you can see that's on the picture on the right. You see that door that's open. That's in one of the tables in the main beautiful room. They actually store the microfilms right there in that space. And so if you look at the boxes in there, those are the absolute first fruits of Himmel's work in the 1960s. Before any of the stuff that we've done since then in other parts of Europe, in Ethiopia, in Asia, and other parts of Africa and Eastern Europe. This is how it all got started. This is how we really became grounded in what we do. Um, but it doesn't stop there, of course, because if you're going to have microfilms, you can't really read them without the proper hübsches Gerät, Lesegerät. And so I would also ask, do you still have the microfilm readers that we provided? Because we made a point of providing each of the monasteries and other libraries with a microfilm reader for using the microfilm. And this was all without cost to those libraries. And yes, indeed, many of them still have them. In some cases, they can't use them anymore because they can't get replacement parts. But you see these, I'm not sure if I would call them attractive, but they are very solid state microfilm readers that were really the standard issue of the time, and really have lasted incredibly well over the years. The what struck me, and these are the only pictures in this section that aren't from me. This is from one of our partner libraries at the Monastery of Rhein. About 15 years ago, they decided that they wanted to digitize their microfilms themselves. So without telling us, they developed a system to digitize all of their microfilms. And since then, they've digitized the manuscripts from the original in color. But the black and white films were all scanned using a digital camera. And if you look carefully at the picture, you'll see the microfilm reels are actually mounted on one piece of the old microfilm reader. So they disassembled the microfilm reader, took the parts that they could use to make the film advance, and then they attached it to a computer and a camera. That is not something we anticipated when we left them there in 1970. So how did Himmel maintain relationships through the years? Well, one of the ways that we did work on that was to work at cataloging the collections. So right from the very beginning, when Father Oliver was there, or his successor, Father Urban, they were typing up inventory cards from each for each microfilm and for each manuscript. And those inventory cards literally were doing something that didn't exist before that. There was no single inventory of manuscripts in the whole country of Austria. We didn't get all of the manuscripts, but we got a lot of them. And so those inventory cards provided a typed version of the metadata that we still, in some ways, work with today. They also, Himmel published concordances so you could match the microfilms with the physical manuscripts at the owning libraries. We started to develop a card catalog like you used to see in the public library, where you would go and find the books on cards in drawers in a big wooden case. We still have many of those cards in the basement because they found out that it was too much work to try to do manuscripts with card catalog. There are many reasons for that, but one of the biggest is that each manuscript may have not one text like a printed book, but might have 10, 20, 100 texts. And that just is too much work to try to do on cards. And then, as I said before, one of the things that we found was that we later used those inventory cards to create our own initial, what we now call legacy catalog, where we were able to put all of this data into an online database and make it available to people around the world. We also, as you see on the list here, we did other services for the libraries. Much of the correspondence in our files relates to getting permission to make copies for scholars to use the microfilms on their own, who couldn't come to the library here. But also there's the kinds of stories that we didn't have a chance of even knowing about in the ways that our library has helped our partners in working with their own materials. So some of it has to do with, as I mentioned before, cataloging the collections, but also research being done on site. One library told me last year that they don't use the microfilms anymore because they had gotten too fragile. And they're too fragile because they were so heavily used in the 1970s and 80s that today they're falling apart. Well, that's incredible. To hear that they were used so much that they couldn't last is a way of telling us, yes, they did have an impact on people's research and people's work. Sometimes it has allowed them to librarians in Austria to restore information that was lost. The book that you see in front of you is a collection of sermons that was in the handwriting of the preacher who actually gave the sermons. And on each of the sermons had a little slip of paper attached to the page that told where and when the sermon was given and had other information about it that was very helpful. But unfortunately, when the book was rebound, which happens with manuscripts, all of those slips were removed from the book without reference to where they were in the book originally. And the librarian told me that, yes, they were able to go back and look at the microfilm to then put those slips of paper that you see that's just one set. Those slips of paper are now in the places where they were originally before it was rebound. It's also happened that manuscripts have disappeared from libraries. Sometimes manuscripts have lost pages in the last 50 years, and they're able to use the microfilms to restore what was on those pages. So there are lots of little ways that we hadn't really anticipated that the films are actually providing support for the librarians over there. What's also fun from the Himmel standpoint is to look and see just ways in which the Himmel work kind of worked its way into the collections themselves. At Lambach, they put new labels on all of the manuscripts, and as you see in the upper left corner, the bottom line is the project number. That's the microfilm number from Himmel. And they included that on the manuscript so that they could match up their manuscript with the microfilm readily and have that information together. I think that's amazing. They actually included us in their own materials. At Guttweig, the upper right corner, you see a little number written in green. It says 3448. That's the Himmel project number for that manuscript in their handwritten catalog, which to this day is the primary catalog of their collection. So, the librarians were obviously interested in matching up what we were doing with what they were doing. Finally, on the visiting the libraries, one of the things I just want to point out is that what we don't realize from our ends, number one, is that these libraries are often huge, huge collections. They have so many books, especially printed books, thousands and thousands of printed books with small staffs, and they have to maintain them. They have to provide access to them. Oftentimes, the cataloging is very old. Occasionally, there are libraries that have their materials all cataloged, usually because some enterprising group has put together an effort to come in and catalog them and put online records for them, and so people can track what they have. But from that perspective, for us at Himmel, what we've done there is a big deal. If we went into a library and microfilmed 500 manuscripts, for us, that's a big deal to have done that. And for them, our partners, it's great, for them too. But we have to realize that for them, those 500 manuscripts only represent maybe not even 5% of their collection, probably, 2% of their collection. And so they got a lot of other stuff on their minds and a lot of other stuff to do. And it's helpful for us to be a little more humble about, what we've accomplished, even though we have accomplished a lot. And in some cases, like the two pictures of fragments on this slide you see, librarians are overwhelmed by materials that they simply can't do anything with. This is from one of our partner libraries in Salzburg. They have lots of unprocessed materials, especially manuscript fragments. And here you see one in Hebrew. And the librarian really doesn't have any staff or any support to be able to even go through and catalog or inventory or identify what these things are. And so there's a lot going on there that we really have to give the librarians extra credit for. So coming into kind of the final set of slides here, my visit in 2025 gave me a chance to go back to several of the places where Father Oliver and Father Urban worked in the 60s and 70s. And some of these cases, there were just little things that were just kind of fun for those of us who are history nerds. So, for example, the picture of Father Oliver taken in 1965 at Seitenstetten, standing on a little footstool, pulling a book off of the shelf. And if you look carefully at my picture in the middle, and I've enlarged it in between, you can see whether it's the exact same step stool or whether it's one that's made exactly to look like it, still there, still in the library. And it's kind of like, wow, 60 years between those two pictures. That's kind of fun. The picture next to that, the librarian on the right, who gave me the tour, has been very generous. He was also the first one to give us permission to put all of their manuscripts, microfilms online. So all of their manuscripts have been, microfilms have been digitized now and can be looked at online. Brought me to the room where he thought they were actually using, the room they were using to do the microfilming in 1965. So, to be able to actually get back right into those very places, I think is pretty amazing. And to know that they're doing well and that they're thriving. It's now an offshoot from one of their classrooms for the sciences. And here again, the librarian in front of the stairs there at the monastery church. And next to it, the picture taken 60 years earlier of Father Oliver with his microfilming team in front of those exact same steps. And to say, this relationship has been there now for 60 years, and we're still working together, and we're still having a great deal of respect and listening going on between us. And I think we're very blessed to have that. I've been blessed to be able to visit other monasteries and have also a strong welcome. At Melk in 2013, the librarian and his sister, who's one of the most eminent manuscript scholars in Austria, actually took me back. Hidden in their stacks was a Festschrift, that is to say, an honorary volume published for Father Oliver Kapsner. So to have that, available is pretty cool. And the fact that they could still find it, I thought was pretty neat. Visiting Gutweig, the librarian there, has been just especially helpful to me in connecting me. In also in Schottenstift. We're currently digitizing their manuscripts. They'll be all available within a few weeks. And the last day I was in Austria, I got to see the Minorites library. And again, a one-person library, one person has to operate a library that contains thousands and thousands of volumes. Uh, I also got to visit places where the librarians, have much more modern spaces. And it just everywhere I went, everyone was extremely receptive and were very fond of hearing about Himmel. Some of them had heard little bits and to fill in their ideas of what had happened. In closing, I just want to remember some of the people who've been connected with the Himmel's work over the years. These are some of the librarians that I met on previous trips. They are now, except for Ingeborg Foreman, who is in the sort of pinkish, purplish jacket. The other librarians are all people who are now retired, but had all worked with Himmel for decades, so that when I met them, they knew immediately who I was, and they knew immediately what Himmel was. Some of the librarians that we've worked with over the years are sadly no longer living. Some of them, Pater Gottfried Glasner just passed away a couple of years ago. He was just the most charming, sweet man, a wonderful tour that he gave me of the library, a friend of HMML for probably 50 years. Uh, Gregor Lechner it was the first Austrian librarian that I met. Again, just very warm, very, very kind. And Karl Rehberger is actually one of the people who was around in 1965 when Father Oliver showed up at St. Florian to microfilm the manuscripts. So, to have that opportunity to meet someone who was actually there 60 years ago, this was in 2015 that I met him, meet someone like that and to realize, that continuity is just something that we thrive on. I will go over these very quickly. You see just how many different places I visited and monasteries and librarians I met with. And then finally, the last slide, we continue. We continue. We've got more work to do. We've got more people to form relationships with, but we also have to keep maintaining those relationships from the past because without them, our work simply wouldn't exist. And with that, I will hand it back and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that really fascinating talk. I really appreciate how you emphasized the collaborative nature and the humanity of these partnerships. It's very easy to see it as, work accomplished as opposed to humans making human decisions. And that was really meaningful to me. So thank you. Um, I'm going to take the opportunity to open the floor to questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll read them out loud. As mentioned at the beginning, we'll get to as many questions today as we can. So I want to start with, have any of these libraries been able to install humidity, temperature, and light improvements, things like Wi-Fi, so that people can use the libraries in different ways?
They would have access to those things in different parts of the library. So what happens is that the main room, the big rooms, are kept more for display, and so they may put in lighting. Some of them do have. You saw some of them that had electrical lighting in there, but they're less workspaces. So the workspaces definitely have electricity. They often don't have as much in the way of strict environmental controls as we do. So their focus is on security to keep people out from damaging them, keeping an eye out for any kind of infestations and stuff like that. But frequently, the storage areas are kept cool and damp enough just by the natural humidity and temperatures that they don't have to, especially in some of the larger ones out in the countryside.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question about the libraries themselves. Have any monasteries that you visited in the past closed and their libraries moved elsewhere?
None of the ones I've visited have closed, but some of the smaller um, convents, so the Minorites, some of their communities have moved their manuscripts elsewhere. The Capuchins, some of those, and have, the manuscripts have moved elsewhere because there was no longer a community at that place. But for the most part, in Austria, they've been able to hold on. We have,
Wonderful.
I know of one in Germany, that one place we worked that did close several years ago.
Shifting a little bit to the microfilms themselves, are images from black and white microfilms still useful for academic study in a world of digital color photography?
Well, actually, yes, for multiple reasons. Certainly, they're not as clean and legible as the digital color photographs, but number one, um, most of the manuscripts haven't been digitized yet. So what we have from many of the libraries that we've worked at, what we are providing in the microfilm is perhaps 10, 20, 30 times more than what's been digitized because it costs money to digitize, you need staff, all of that is going to take a while before they get there. The other thing is the microfilms are very legible for the most part. Occasionally pages are bad, but it allows people who are trying to catalog or to inventory what's in the collections the ability to see the texts and to identify the texts. So even if they can't do the detailed codicology of determining what the parchment is made out of and that sort of thing, uh, that's that's not going to happen, but they can do a lot of the work. A lot of the cataloging done at Milk and at Michaelboyan was done using microfilms that the librarians or the catalogers could take home with them and use away from the library. So in that sense, it's very useful. And then finally, as I said during the talk, in some cases, data has been lost. Things have been lost from the manuscript, so the manuscript has disappeared, and the microfilm is now our primary access to the contents of that manuscript.
Wonderful. A little bit more about the microfilms. Can you talk about the fate of microfilms generally at Himmel? In addition to the Austrian ones, are there other microfilm collections and what's happening to them?
Hmm. So for the first 38 years that Himmel existed, or I should say that our library existed, the first 10 years it wasn't called Himmel. So, but for the first 38 years, everything we did was done on microfilm. We did not start using digital photography until 2003, which means that an incredibly large portion of what we photographed is still only available in microfilm. Austria was the first place, as we've just heard, but then later we worked in Spain, Ethiopia, Malta, Germany, England, Portugal, South Africa, Sweden. All of these places we photographed manuscripts, and in some of these places we did pretty extensive photography. The Ethiopian collection is still considered really one of the foundational collections of manuscript studies in Ethiopia. And the fact that all of these things were available and were cataloged. As I said, maintaining the relationship from our end was we had to establish what was in the manuscripts so that people could study them. And that really, the Ethiopian catalog is really a document that will last forever, I think.
Wonderful. Can you say a bit more about the slow starts or non-starts in Italy and Switzerland?
Sure. When Father Oliver came to Europe in 1964 to approach libraries and ask their permission for access to photograph the manuscripts, he had a letter of agreement or a letter of permission from the abbot of Monte Cassino in Italy. And he had a few other Benedictine monasteries in Italy that he was going to visit, and um, the plan was is that that was going to be the biggest project of all, was doing Monte Cassino. Unfortunately, when he got to Monte Cassino, in this case, the librarian or the archivist overruled the abbot who had given permission. The archivist said, no, you cannot do that. You cannot come into our library and spend a year microfilming our manuscripts. And so we've never worked in Monte Cassino, and that was a big blow because that was really the biggest collection we were talking about at the time. After that, we were able to get some manuscripts from two smaller Benedictine houses at Cava and at Subiaco. But in Italy, the rules of the game were different in that the manuscripts belonged to the state and not to the monastery. And so all of the microfilming of the manuscripts had to be done by staff from the monastery, not by Himmel. In Austria, the relationship was different. The monasteries that had manuscripts actually owned the manuscripts, and so the agreement to do the work came from them, so that we were allowed to do that. In Switzerland, while Father Oliver received positive feedback from the librarians, he was not given permission. And it took another 30 years after Father Oliver was there for some of the Swiss libraries to agree to work with us. And there are reasons for that. There apparently were discussions among the librarians before he came, and they had agreed that they shouldn't work with these Americans who probably wanted to make a profit off the manuscripts anyway. Profiting off of black and white microfilm is not generally very likely if you can't even read the text. But so we had partial successes in those places. Italy in the 60s and in Switzerland in the 90s, 1990s.
Well, you've answered this in part, but we have a couple of questions about what are the challenges to securing partnerships at local libraries, and what do you think are the reasons they're reluctant to give permissions? Things like personal politics, fear of mishandling, and I'd like to add to that, why do you think they do give permission
Mhm.
when the time comes?
Well, why I think they do give us permission, I'll start with that, is I think because after 60 years or even over the last 20 years, they've seen our track record of what we do. They see how we respect their wishes. And so they realize that we are not out to try to pull a fast one on anyone. There's no reason to deceive them. But why there may be hesitation, as I tried to say earlier, when we approach these libraries, we're not approaching individuals. So I visited 25 libraries last year, and every librarian was in favor of our digitizing the microfilm. They all were interested in it, but each of them, number one, didn't have the authority to sign off on things themselves, and they represent communities, and those communities, every community is different. Whether it's a monastic community, a state library, a university, each one is going to have its own internal structure of what's going on and decision-making process. And each person in that process is going to have a different personality. And so we do what we can to work together, and we have to leave it ultimately to the owning libraries, and not try to strike out on our own.
One last question that gets to the heart of this issue of preservation. Since microfilm naturally deteriorates over time, were there any initiatives at Himmel or within the original holding libraries to recopy or preserve them prior to digitization in order to prevent further loss?
We did not have a policy in place to make new copies, but the possibility did exist to make new copies, at least the technology today. Of course, it's harder to make copies of films onto new film, but the estimate was that the microfilms we were making could last up to 200 years. And so within that time, the hope was that there would be new ways of making copies, which indeed now there are. But that because there were 3 copies of every film made, as I mentioned before, and one of them was a negative copy, which would be in deep storage, that negative copy could always be used to make new microfilm copies if the old positive copies started to deteriorate. So that was always our plan, was to have a backup somewhere.
Hey, thank you so much. I'll close out the webinar. A huge thank you to Matt for presenting, and a huge shout out to Catherine for hosting the Q&A session. I think there was some wonderful questions about how we work and the partnerships that we create. It's wonderful to see the 60 years of continuity in some of those pictures of the same place being photographed. That was really fun. Thank you everyone for joining us in the final installment of the Winter Lecture Series. I hope you enjoyed your time with us. I want to encourage you to sign up for our e-newsletter so you can stay up to date for the next winter lecture series and other events that we have going on. And then finally, upon exiting the screen, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. If you have time, please fill it out. It helps us create programming that you would enjoy. I'll put my contact details up on the screen once I'm done speaking, and if you have further questions or you would like your question answered if we didn't get to it, please send me an email and I will pass it along to the relevant person. So thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you at the next HMML event. Have a wonderful day.
Peace.